Have you ever found yourself um, reacting totally differently to the same basic information? Just because of how someone put it.
Oh, yeah. Like the whole glass half full, glass half empty thing.
Exactly. That kind of thing. Okay, let's really unpack this because today we're diving deep into something called framing. We've pulled together some really fascinating material that gets right to the core of how the way stuff is presented shapes how we understand, well, pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm.
So our mission today is basically to get a clear handle on what framing actually is, the different ways it crops up,
Right.
why it affects us so much, and maybe how we can get a bit more savvy about it.
That's right. And it's not just like clever marketing speak or political spin, though that's part of it. Framing is, well, it's fundamental to how we process the world.
It really is.
And it's absolutely everywhere. News headlines, yeah, but also social media feeds, advertising, even just, chats you have every day. Framing's working away in the background.
Totally. It's less about the raw information itself and more about how it's all packaged up. That's what seems to really shift our perspective.
Exactly, the presentation.
So the American Psychological Association, they define framing as basically the way we set up the context around an issue or an event.
Mm.
And that context then influences how we see it and, how we judge it.
Right.
But what's really interesting, I think, is that it seems to work on two levels at the same time.
Oh, how so? What are these two levels?
Well, first, it's like a cognitive bias, right? A kind of potential hiccup in our thinking. We might make different choices, even when the options are logically the same, just based on whether they're framed as, say, a gain or a loss.
Right, the classic examples.
Yeah. But then it's also more fundamental than that. It's part of how we collectively make sense of things,
Mhm.
how we
Yeah.
build these shared understandings of the world. Framing helps create those lenses we all look through.
Huh. So it's partly an individual psychology thing, a potential glitch, but also a building block for shared meaning. That's
So that's a
weird.
powerful mix. It really is.
And you're right, it pops up everywhere. Politics, obviously, the media, but also things like how your doctor explains treatment options, right?
Absolutely. The reach is just incredible. It shapes political debates, media stories, those healthcare decisions, legal stuff, how we spend money, even just, casual conversations.
Mhm.
These subtle shifts in wording, they can have a surprisingly big effect on what we end up thinking or preferring, even if the basic facts haven't changed an inch.
The key thing seems to be that someone, somewhere, is always doing the selecting, yeah, choosing what to highlight, what to push into the background to sort of guide how we take it all in.
Precisely. Selection and emphasis.
Yeah.
That's the core of it.
Okay, so let's dig into that. How does this framing thing actually work? What are the sort of the big ideas that help us understand the mechanics of it?
Right. To really get into it, we need to look at some key theories. Maybe let's start with the psychological side. Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory is huge here.
Ah, yes. Prospect theory. Nobel Prize winners, right? How does their work connect specifically to framing?
Well, it really helps explain why those logically identical choices we were just talking about can provoke such different reactions in people. The core idea is we don't judge things in isolation, in absolute terms. We judge them relative to some kind of reference point.
Like what we expect or what we have now.
Exactly, what we currently have or maybe what we expected to get. And this comparison thing leads to some really interesting predictable quirks in our thinking.
You mean like loss aversion? That feels like a big one.
That's the big one, yeah. Loss aversion. Psychologically, the pain of losing something just feels way stronger than the pleasure of gaining something equivalent.
Like finding a 20-pound note feels good, but losing one feels really bad.
Exactly.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
sting is just disproportionately worse.
Yeah.
Then there's something called diminishing sensitivity, which means the impact of a gain or a loss kind of lessens as the amounts get bigger. So the difference between getting nothing and getting 10 pounds feels bigger than the difference between getting 100 pounds and getting 110 pounds.
Right. The first 10 pounds feels more significant.
Uh-huh. And one more, probability weighting. We tend to, overweight tiny probabilities, like thinking we might actually win the lottery, and underweight moderate or high probabilities. We're not great natural statisticians.
Okay. Loss aversion, diminishing sensitivity, probability weighting. So how do these psychological tendencies make framing so effective?
Well, think about that medical example.
Yeah.
A procedure with a 90% survival rate. Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Same procedure, framed as having a 10% mortality rate. logically identical. But that 10% mortality, it hits our loss aversion button hard. It feels riskier, scarier, even though the outcome is statistically the same.
Ah, I see. The loss frame just triggers a stronger negative reaction.
Precisely. And the 90% fat-free versus contains 10% fat on food packaging. Same principle. One highlights the gain, fat removed, the other, the loss, fat remaining.
And people reliably prefer the fat-free frame.
Yep. And classic experiments like the Asian disease problem Kahneman and Tversky did really nailed this. Framing choices in terms of lives saved versus lives lost completely flipped people's preferences between a sure thing and a gamble, even though the outcomes were identical.
It really shows how our underlying psychology makes us, well, susceptible to the way things are presented. Okay, so that's the psychological engine. What about the sociological angle? You mentioned Goffman earlier.
Yes, Irving Goffman, a hugely influential sociologist. He looked at frames differently. He saw them as definitions of the situation, basically the shared understandings we use to make sense of what's happening around us and figure out our role in it.
So they're like the mental templates we use to interpret social events.
Yeah.
Answering the question, what's going on here?
Exactly. He talked about primary frameworks, these really fundamental lenses we use. He made a distinction between natural frameworks, where we interpret events as just physical happenings, governed by nature, like, the weather changing, no human intention involved.
Right. A storm is just a storm.
Exactly. And then social frameworks, where we understand events as being driven by people, by their intentions, their motives, social rules, that kind of thing, like a courtroom trial or a party.
So the classic example of a blink versus a wink fits here, right? A blink is natural, a wink is social.
Perfect example. Physically, they might look almost identical, but the social framework we apply to the wink gives it a whole layer of meaning, intention, communication, maybe flirtation, who knows?
Right.
And Goffman stressed that these frames aren't fixed. We're constantly negotiating them, adjusting them in our interactions with others to kind of arrive at a shared sense of what's happening.
Okay, interesting. So Kahneman and Tversky show us the individual mind, susceptible to gains and losses. Goffman shows us the social context, how we collectively define situations. What about communication studies? Entman's name came up.
Yes, Robert Entman. He really focused on how frames are constructed and used, especially in media and political communication. His key idea is that framing involves two main things: selection and salience.
Selection and salience. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means the communicator selects certain aspects of reality, they choose what to focus on, and then they make those aspects more salient.
Meaning more noticeable, more prominent.
Exactly. More noticeable, more meaningful, easier to remember. They do this in the way they talk or write about it, the images they use, all to promote a particular interpretation or evaluation of the issue.
So it really is about highlighting some things and inevitably downplaying or ignoring others.
Precisely. And Entman identified 4 key functions that frames typically perform. They usually have one. 1, define the problem. 2, diagnose the causes. 3, make moral judgments. And 4, suggest remedies or solutions.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Take homelessness. One frame might define the problem as individual failure, problem. Blame it on lack of personal responsibility, cause. Judge it negatively, moral judgment. And suggest tougher rules on rough sleeping, remedy.
Okay.
Another frame might define it as a housing crisis, problem. Blame it on lack of affordable housing and social support, cause. Judge it as a societal failing, moral judgment. And suggest building more social housing, remedy. See? Same issue, totally different frames leading to different conclusions.
Right. Those 4 functions really structure the narrative. Did Entman talk about where these frames actually exist?
He did. He pointed out that frames aren't just in the message itself. They exist in the mind of the communicator sending the message, and the text or image is used in the mind of the receiver interpreting it, and also within the broader culture, the shared assumptions, the stories we all kind of draw on.
So they're embedded all over the place.
Yeah. And he also made a really useful distinction between framing and something else called agenda setting.
Ah, okay. How are they different?
Agenda setting is about influencing what issues people think about, which topics get attention, basically. Framing, on the other hand, is about influencing how people think about those specific issues once they're on the agenda.
Got it. So agenda setting is what to think about. Framing is how to think about it. That's helpful. Okay, one more theoretical area mentioned was social movements. Snow and Benford, how do they fit in?
Right. Sociologists like David Snow and Robert Benford looked specifically at how social movements use framing very consciously, very strategically, to mobilize people. For them, framing isn't just happening. It's something activists do to achieve their goals.
So it's an intentional tool for getting people involved.
Exactly. They identified 3 core framing tasks that
Mhm.
movements need to accomplish. First, diagnostic framing, defining the problem, figuring out what's wrong, and often assigning blame, pointing the finger.
Okay, identifying the injustice and who's responsible.
Yep. Second, prognostic framing, proposing solutions, what should be done about the problem, what's the plan, the strategy.
Offering a way forward.
And third, motivational framing, providing the rationale for action. Why should people care? Why should they get involved now? It's the call to arms, basically.
Diagnose the problem, propose a solution, motivate people to act. Makes sense.
And they also talked about the importance of frame alignment. Movements need to connect their frames, their way of seeing the problem and solution, with the existing beliefs and values of the people they're trying to recruit.
So they need to make it resonate with potential supporters.
Exactly. Resonance is key. Does the frame seem believable? Does it feel relevant to people's lives? They also mentioned interpretative scope, basically, how widely applicable the frame is. Can it help people make sense of lots of different events or just one narrow issue?
Okay, wow. So we've got the psychological drivers from Kahneman and Tversky, the social sense-making from Goffman, the communication selection and salience from Entman, and the strategic mobilization from Snow and Benford. That really paints a picture of framing operating on, well, multiple levels.
Exactly. It's not just one thing. These different perspectives give us a much richer, more solid grasp of the whole phenomenon.
All right, so we've got the theories mapped out, but let's circle back to the individual. How does this actually feel? What's going on in our heads that makes us so, well, influenceable by these frames?
Well, like we said with prospect theory, those cognitive shortcuts, heuristics, and biases are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Loss aversion is huge, pushing us away from perceived threats.
Right.
Then you've got the availability heuristic. We tend to judge how likely or common something is based on how easily examples spring to mind.
So if a frame makes certain things really vivid or memorable.
And those things feel more frequent or important than they might actually be.
Yeah.
A dramatic news story using an episodic frame focusing on one powerful case can make that specific problem seem much more widespread because it's so easy to recall.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then there's the affect heuristic. This is where our gut feelings, our immediate emotional reactions drive our judgments and decisions.
So how we feel about something instantly influences what we think about it.
Pretty much. And frames are often explicitly designed to tap into those emotions. They aim to trigger hope or fear or anger or sympathy.
Emotions seem absolutely central to this, don't they?
Oh, definitely. Think about political ads or charity appeals. They often use carefully chosen words and images precisely to evoke a specific emotional response. That feeling then colors how we process the rest of the information.
That idea of an emotional array that a frame creates. It sounds powerful.
It is. And sometimes a single powerful image can completely shift the emotional landscape around an issue. The photo of Aylan Kurdi, the young Syrian refugee boy on the beach.
I remember that vividly.
It had an absolutely massive impact. It bypassed rational arguments for a moment and just hit people emotionally, dramatically changing the media framing and public conversation about the refugee crisis almost overnight.
A stark reminder that it's often not just about logic. Our feelings are deeply involved.
Exactly. And this links to how we process information generally. Often we're running on autopilot, using what psychologists call heuristic processing, quick, intuitive, relies on shortcuts, gut feelings.
The easy way, mentally speaking.
Yeah. And framing often encourages this because it simplifies complex issues, making them easier to grasp quickly.
Right.
The alternative is systematic or deliberative processing. That's slower, more effortful, more analytical.
Like really thinking things through.
Right. And when we engage that slower, more deliberate thinking, we tend to be less susceptible to framing effects. But things like being rushed or tired or distracted push us towards the faster heuristic mode.
So basically, if we don't have the time or energy to think deeply, we're more likely to just accept the frame presented to us.
That seems to be the case. Our reliance on these shortcuts, loss aversion, availability, affect heuristic, they all kind of work together to make framing effective, especially when we're processing quickly.
It's efficient, but potentially misleading.
Exactly. And interestingly, some research suggests that when people process information in a foreign language, framing effects can sometimes be weaker.
Oh, that's fascinating. Why would that be?
The thinking is that using a non-native language forces your brain to work a bit harder. It slows you down, maybe reduces the reliance on those automatic emotional responses and intuitive shortcuts, and engages more deliberate analytical processing.
So the extra cognitive effort disrupts the easy path of the frame. Huh.
Seems like it. And one last piece of the psychological puzzle. Our existing knowledge and beliefs are schemas. Frames don't operate in a vacuum. They interact with what we already think and value.
So a frame is more likely to work if it kind of fits with what I already believe.
Exactly. It's like priming. If a frame resonates with your existing schemas, your values, your experiences, it's much more likely to be accepted and influential. But if it clashes strongly with your core beliefs, you're more likely to notice it and resist it.
So our own mental landscape shapes how frames affect us. That makes sense. Okay, so we've got the theories, the psychology, but are all frames the same? Or are there different types we should know about? You mentioned different categories earlier.
Yeah. Researchers have sliced and diced frames in a few useful ways. One really important distinction is between equivalence framing and emphasis framing.
Equivalence and emphasis. Okay, what's the difference there?
Equivalence framing is what we talked about with prospect theory, presenting the exact same information in different ways that are logically identical, but still lead to different choices.
Like the 90% survival versus 10% mortality rate.
Exactly. Or 90% fat-free versus 10% fat. The underlying reality is the same, just described differently, usually highlighting a gain versus a loss.
Got it. So what's emphasis framing?
Emphasis framing is different. Here, you're not just rewording identical information. You're choosing to highlight different aspects of a complex issue, maybe different facts or different values. These different aspects aren't logically equivalent.
Okay, so it's about selecting which part of the issue to focus on.
Precisely. Think about, say, a controversial KKK rally. One frame might emphasize the free speech aspect. Another might emphasize the public safety concerns. Both aspects are relevant, but focusing on one over the other pushes you towards a different conclusion about whether the rally should be allowed.
Ah, I see. So equivalence is about how you say the same thing. Emphasis is about what part of the issue you choose to talk about.
You've got it. And a common type of emphasis framing you see in the news is the difference between episodic and thematic frames.
Episodic versus thematic.
Episodic frames focus on individual stories, specific events, or case studies, like a news report about one particular person who lost their job.
Okay.
Thematic frames look at the bigger picture, broader trends, societal context. So a report on overall unemployment rates, economic policies, systemic issues contributing to joblessness.
And presumably these lead to different interpretations.
Very much so. Episodic framing often leads audiences to attribute responsibility to the individuals involved. That person must have done something wrong. Thematic framing encourages people to think about societal factors and potential systemic solutions.
Right. Focusing on one homeless person versus focusing on national housing policy. Very different implications.
Absolutely. Then, of course, there's the fundamental gain versus loss framing, or valence framing. We've already discussed highlighting the positive outcomes versus the negative ones. Gain frames tend to make people more risk-averse, while loss frames can make them more willing to take risks to avoid the loss.
Okay.
And beyond these broader categories, you get lots of issue-specific frames. In politics, you constantly see frames tied to ideologies. Tax relief sounds positive, suggesting a burden lifted, whereas tax cuts sounds more neutral or could even imply cuts to services.
Language matters hugely there.
Definitely. The media often uses recurring frames like the conflict frame, focusing on disagreements, the human interest frame, telling personal stories, the economic consequences frame, or the morality frame. And social movements use their diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational frames. Even Goffman's natural versus social frameworks can be seen as types of frames applied to specific situations. It's a whole toolkit.
Wow, okay. That really lays out the different ways framing can operate. So let's talk about where we actually see these playing out most powerfully in the real world. Politics seems like an obvious starting point.
Oh, absolutely. Political communication is saturated with framing. What politicians often call spin is basically just strategic framing. They meticulously choose words. Is it pro-life or anti-abortion? Is it an investment or government spending? Is it tax relief or tax cuts for the rich?
Every word is calculated for its framing effect.
Pretty much. And it affects polling, too. How you phrase a question about, say, allowing a controversial group to hold a rally, frame it as protecting free speech versus preventing public disorder, can massively shift the poll results.
Because you're making different values salient.
Exactly. And major policy debates, healthcare reform, climate change action, Social Security, are often fundamentally battles over which frame will dominate the public understanding of the problem and the potential solutions.
A contest of frames. What about the media's role?
The media are obviously huge players, simply by deciding what stories to cover, agenda setting, and then how to tell those stories, which facts to include, which sources to quote, what images to use. Journalists are constantly framing reality, whether intentionally or not.
It's inherent in the process of constructing a narrative.
It is. And these media frames have a documented influence on public opinion, on how people understand complex issues like poverty or international conflicts. It's useful here to distinguish between frame building, the process by which frames emerge, often influenced by elites, politicians, or events.
And frame setting, which is the impact those frames then have on the audience.
Exactly. How the frames pushed by the media actually shape audience attitudes and understanding.
Okay. What about health communication? That seems like another critical area.
Hugely important. We already talked about how framing treatment options in terms of survival versus mortality rates can sway patient decisions about things like cancer treatment.
Yeah, that's a life and death example.
It really is. Public health campaigns also rely heavily on framing. Should you frame getting a vaccine in terms of the gains, protecting yourself and others, or the potential losses, getting sick if you don't? Research suggests gain frames often work better for prevention behaviors, like using sunscreen, while loss frames might be more effective for detection behaviors, like getting screened for a disease.
Interesting nuance there. Gain for prevention, loss for detection.
Yeah, though it's not always clear-cut. And framing pops up in law, too. Think about plea bargaining. Is the deal framed as a gain, avoiding a potentially much longer sentence, or a loss, giving up the right to trial, accepting conviction? How the lawyers frame it can influence a defendant's choice.
Right. And in the marketplace. Consumer behavior.
Oh, constantly. Marketing and advertising are often masters of framing. That 90% fat-free label is a classic. Pricing strategies, too, was £100. Now £75 frames it as a gain or saving. How financial advisors frame risk can impact investment decisions. And some research suggests older adults might be particularly susceptible to framing effects in financial contexts.
That's a bit concerning.
It is. And finally, back to social movements. They are actively and strategically using diagnostic, prognostic, and motivational frames to build support, mobilize action, and challenge dominant narratives.
So it really is woven into the fabric of, well, almost everything.
Pretty much. The key takeaway is that while the basic psychological susceptibility might be universal, how effective any specific frame is depends hugely on the context, the audience, the source. And importantly, especially with the media, framing isn't just a passive reflection of reality, it actively participates in constructing that reality. That Aileen Curdy image didn't just report an event, it reshaped how many people understood and felt about the entire crisis. It created a feedback loop.
That's a powerful point. The frame can change the reality it's describing. Okay, so if we're all potentially susceptible, but effectiveness varies, what makes a framework? What factors influence whether it sticks or not?
Yeah, good question. Several things come into play. First, audience characteristics. Who is receiving the message?
Like what?
Well, age seems to matter sometimes. As we mentioned, some studies suggest older adults might be more influenced by framing, maybe due to changes in cognitive processing, especially in health and finance. Adolescents, perhaps surprisingly, might sometimes be less susceptible, maybe relying more on analysis.
That is interesting. What about knowledge? If you know a lot about a topic, are you immune?
It's complicated. More knowledge can help you counter-argue against a frame you disagree with, but it can also make you more susceptible to frames that resonate strongly with your existing sophisticated understanding, or, especially, your partisan leanings. If you're a strong partisan, a frame coming from your side might be accepted almost automatically, regardless of the content.
So prior beliefs and values are critical filters.
Absolutely critical. Frames that align with your existing worldview, your schemas, your values, they just land better. They feel right. Frames that clash with your core beliefs often face strong resistance. And as we touched on, the language itself matters. Processing in a non-native language seems to dampen framing effects, probably because it forces more cognitive effort and less reliance on automatic emotional responses.
Okay, so audience age, knowledge, beliefs, language. What about the person or organization sending the message? The source.
Source characteristics are definitely important. Credibility is key. We're generally more persuaded by frames coming from sources we perceive as trustworthy, expert, or unbiased.
Makes sense.
And in politics, the source's perceived partisanship is huge. For many people, knowing which party or politician endorses a particular frame can be more influential than the actual content of the frame itself. Party cues can be powerful shortcuts.
A heuristic in itself, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then finally, there are message characteristics. What is it about the frame itself that makes it effective?
Like how it's worded.
Yes, but also things like repetition and salience. The more often you hear a frame, the more prominent it is, the more likely it is to be processed and recalled. Cultural resonance is also big frames that tap into widely shared cultural values. Symbols, myths, or narratives tend to be very powerful.
Because they feel familiar and intuitively right.
Precisely. Emotional elements, as we've seen, add punch. Frames that evoke strong feelings are often more memorable and persuasive. And clarity and simplicity often help too. In a complex world, frames that offer a simple, easy-to-understand explanation are often favored because they reduce cognitive load.
So it's not just one thing, it's this complex interplay between the audience, the source, and the message, all happening within a specific cultural and linguistic context.
Exactly. That's what determines whether a frame really takes hold or just fizzles out.
Which underlines again how significant this all is. Framing isn't just some minor linguistic quirk, it has real power.
Absolutely. It has the power to shape understanding, guide interpretations of cause and effect, influence moral judgments, and ultimately point towards certain solutions while obscuring others. The ability to successfully frame an issue is a major source of power in society.
And this raises ethical questions, doesn't it? Is framing inherently manipulative?
That's the tricky part. Some level of framing is unavoidable in communication. You have to select and emphasize to tell any coherent story. The ethical line arguably depends on intent and effect. Is the frame being used to genuinely simplify a complex issue for clarity? Or is it being used to distort reality, obscure important facts, or manipulate emotions for deceptive ends?
It's a fine line sometimes.
It can be. And it's also useful to distinguish framing clearly from straightforward persuasion. Persuasion often involves changing someone's core beliefs or attitudes through argument and evidence. Framing often works more subtly, as we said, by changing the salience or weight given to different considerations that people already hold. It's about influencing which beliefs come to mind and seem most important in that moment.
So it's like rearranging the mental furniture rather than bringing in new pieces. Pre-persuasion, you called it.
That's a good way to put it. By setting the terms of the debate, framing shapes which arguments even seem relevant.
And public discourse is often just this ongoing battle between competing frames, isn't it? Different groups trying to get their version accepted.
Exactly. It's a contest of frames.
Mm.
But, and this is crucial, it's not always a fair fight. As we hinted before, who gets to build and promote frames effectively often depends on power, political power, media access, financial resources. Elite groups often have a much bigger megaphone for shaping dominant frames.
That power dynamic is definitely something we need to keep in mind. Okay, so given all this, the power, the psychology, the ubiquity, how can we, just as everyday people consuming information, navigate this? How do we become more aware, maybe even mitigate the effects?
It starts with awareness. Just knowing that framing is a constant feature of communication is the first big step. Then you can start actively looking for it.
What should we look out for?
Pay attention to the specific keywords and language being used. Are there emotionally loaded terms, metaphors, specific labels like tax relief versus tax cuts? Think about selection and emphasis. What aspects of the story are being highlighted? Equally important, what's being left out or downplayed?
Looking for the omissions.
Exactly. Analyze the sources and images. Who is being quoted? Who is shown? How are they portrayed? Images can be incredibly powerful framing devices. Examine the narrative structure. How is the problem being defined? What causes are being suggested? What solutions are implicitly or explicitly favored? And maybe the most practical tip, compare presentations. How are different news outlets, different politicians, different commentators framing the exact same event or issue? Seeing the contrast can really reveal the frames at work.
So it's about becoming a more active, critical consumer, not just passively absorbing information. What strategies can we use once we spot a frame?
Well, seeking out multiple perspectives is key, as we just said. Don't live in an information bubble. Actively try to identify the frame and its function. What definition of the situation is being pushed here? Then, critically, consider the source. Who is delivering this frame? What are their known biases, motivations, interests? Who benefits from you accepting this frame?
Questioning the agenda behind the frame.
Yes, and consciously try to engage deliberative thinking. Pause. Resist the immediate emotional pull or the easy answer offered by the frame. Try to actively reframe the information yourself. If it's presented as a gain, think about the loss. If it focuses on individuals, think about the systemic context and try to focus on the substance over the style. Separate the factual claims and logical arguments from the way they're packaged or presented.
It sounds like it really requires conscious mental effort to push back against those automatic tendencies.
It absolutely does, because framing often works by tapping into our faster, more intuitive System 1 thinking. Mitigating its effects requires engaging our slower, more effortful System 2 thinking. It takes practice and vigilance.
And we should probably acknowledge the limits too, right? Individual awareness is great, but systemic factors matter.
Definitely. Things like media ownership concentration, intense political polarization, the algorithms driving social media feeds these larger forces also shape the framing landscape in ways that individual critical thinking alone can't fully counteract. Improving media literacy is crucial, but it's only part of the solution.
Still, becoming aware is a powerful start. This has been, well, really illuminating. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah. So I guess the main takeaway is that framing is this incredibly pervasive, powerful force. It's operating under the surface a lot of the time, shaping how we see things, how we feel, and what we decide to do.
It's both a quirk of our own minds and a fundamental tool used in communication everywhere, from politics to personal chats.
Exactly. And hopefully understanding how it works, the psychology, the different types, where it shows up, gives you, the listener, a bit more power. It helps you become a more discerning, more critical reader of the world around you.
So, maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Start noticing. As you go about your day, as you read the news, scroll through social media, listen to politicians, even just chat with friends, try to spot the frames. Ask yourself, how is this being presented? What's being emphasized? What's left out?
Yeah, and maybe even try this. Take one piece of information you encounter in the next 24 hours and deliberately try to reframe it.
Yeah.
Look at it from the opposite perspective. If it's a gain, see the loss. If it's about free speech, consider public safety. Just play with it. See what happens.
It's a good exercise. So the question to leave you with is, now that you're more aware of framing, what will you notice differently?